I quickly want to talk about how to create one pivot table from another pivot table, where essentially you're sharing the pivot cache of each pivot table. So there's a pivot table object, and then there's the pivot cache that each pivot table is connected to, and that's the underlying data behind the pivot table. And so you can share this cache between pivot tables, and this saves file space. It saves time, where you don't have to go to separate pivot caches, and you basically can share one pivot cache between multiple pivot tables. But there are some drawbacks to this, which I also will show you. So let's first create a pivot table here, where I'm going to go to Insert, Pivot Table. I'm going to select my range. Control Shift right arrow, Control Shift down arrow. Okay, and we have our pivot table. Customer revenue. I'm going to go ahead and put in date here. And then I'm going to group my date by quarters. Okay, so now I have my pivot table and my pivot table date grouped by quarters. So I can quickly create another pivot table based upon this pivot table by just selecting the pivot table, copying it, Control C, and then Control V, and I have another pivot table. So this is great. So maybe up above I want to show revenue by quarter, and below maybe I just want to show a total of all revenue. So I can do some dashboarding type stuff. But the drawback here is, remember, it's sharing the same pivot cache. So if I'm going to pull my day back in here, and you can see this is by quarter. So if I come over here and I change the grouping here and go to group, and let's say I make this by months instead of quarters, notice how both pivot tables now are changed. So that's one thing to take into consideration when you have pivot tables that are sharing the same pivot cache and created off of one another. If you want to have different groupings, then you want to make sure that the pivot table goes back to the original source.